So, hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to our fifth web forum, Max Weber Foundation Web Forum on the digital transformation. Today, this fifth session, this fifth event is special. It has a special format. It's a lecture. It was originally planned as the keynote in our two-day conference, and I'm very happy that our guest, the keynote speaker, Professor FICKERS from Luxembourg, that he was willing to stay with us even under with this digital format. So he will talk today about what the D does to history, the digital age as a new historical time regime. We took up this topic, digital transformation, because one of our research foci at the German Institute for Japanese Studies, of course, we look at the digital transformation not from an engineering or a technical perspective, but from a humanities, social science perspective. And what has been lacking so far has been a more thorough sort of historical perspective. Of course, the digital transformation, the technology itself is not as old. One might, of course, trace it back to the computer, the history of the computer. But of course, it's you can ask, what is special about this new technology? We, as a non-historian, I used to talk about the digital age. We're just about to publish a book about financial systems in the digital age, and maybe that's not something you would so easily use or put in a title. If you look at it from a historical perspective, we think, of course, about the Industrial Revolution as a new stage, but as you know, that in Germany we have Industry 4.0, Industry 4.0, and in Japan we have Society 5.0, 5.0. So it seems that the digital transformation, at least when we look at these national programs or visions, that there is a new a new time regime. But whether this actually holds true, if we analyze it from a thorough historical perspective, we will hear today. Let me briefly introduce our speaker, Andreas FICKERS. He's the director of the Luxembourg Center for Contemporary and Digital History. And it's the third interdisciplinary center of this university. He studied history, philosophy, and sociology, and is currently professor for contemporary and digital history at the University of Luxembourg. His research focuses on European history of technology, mainly communication technology. So I think he's very well fit to discuss with us the adequateness of talking about the digital age. Now, the session later on will be moderated by Harald KÜMMERLE, whom you can also see already. And he's a senior researcher at DIJ. He did his studies, undergraduate and graduate studies, actually in mathematics and informatics at the University of Munich, and then decided to embark on Japanese studies for his PhD. And very successfully, he worked on the history of Western mathematics in Japan, and also was awarded a prize for his dissertation. And he will moderate today, and he is actually working on our research focus, the digital transformation, both applying tools, methods of digital history, but also working on Japan's attempt to capture the data which underlie the digital transformation. He's working on Japan's initiatives of so-called information banks. Now, Harald, I would hand over to you and ask you maybe if you would like to add something about the speaker, about the topic, and then we'll have the presentation by Professor FICKERS, and I think there will be enough time after his presentation to take questions from the floor. So don't be shy. You can put your questions in the chat. We will pick them up. And if not, later on, I think the group is not too big. You can raise your hand if you have questions and if you want to present the questions directly to the audience later on during the Q&A part. So Harald, you are next. And thank you. I'm looking forward to a great evening.
Thank you. I'm glad to welcome Andreas FICKERS, who has presented at many other institutes of the Max Weber Stiftung. We would like to welcome him in Tokyo sometime when this is possible again. Andreas FICKERS is well known in the digital history community. He was, for example, one of the keynote speakers at the Digital History Conference this March. Notably, he is the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Digital History, whose first issue has just appeared. The format is very innovative and articles have multiple layers: narrative, hermeneutic, and data layers. This makes him an ideal speaker in this series on the digital transformation. His topic today is what the D does to history, the digital age as a new historical time regime. Mr. FICKERS, the floor is yours.
Very much for the kind introduction and for having me as a speaker today. First of all, I will try to share my screen with you, and yeah, maybe you can give me a thumb when you see my screen. Okay, perfect. Yeah, as I said, I'm very happy to speak to you today. The talk I will be presenting today is a bit of a more theoretical, conceptual talk on what the D does to history. So it's sometimes a bit maybe philosophical. So that's why I'm really staying a bit closer to my manuscript. Yeah, I nevertheless hope that you will be able to follow and that we will have a good discussion afterwards. In October 2019, the German Historical Institute in Washington, and I see that Jana Keck from the GHI is also with us today, hosted the conference Digital Hermeneutics from Research to Dissemination, organized both by the GHI in collaboration with the Roy Rosenzweig Center and the C2DH in Luxembourg. In the final discussion, in which eminent digital historians such as Alan Leo, Tim Hitchcock, or Jessica Owens were invited to make concluding remarks, an interesting discussion unfolded about how the manifold methodological and epistemological implications of the digital for the historical science could be described or grasped. In other words, the discussion centered around the question, what does the D with a capital D to history? In its directness and simplicity, this question conceals a complexity whose ramifications continue to concern me until today. Accordingly, what is presented to you today in this lecture reflects a very time and place-bound insight into a reflection process that is characterized or can be characterized by what I would call cautious heuristic groping, and feels obliged to what Michel Serres, the French philosopher of science, had described as randonneur. Strike out sideways. Débrouillez-vous. That was Serres' advice in the chapter Method and Wondering in his quite famous book, The Five Senses, a Philosophy of Mingled Bodies. Indeed, approaching the digital as capital D feels like the exodus of Ulysses described by Sayre, a journey characterized by deviations, fluctuations, and dispersions rather than a Cartesian linearity. The semantics of the term randonnée, originating from the French courir à randon, which means to hunt for game, and reading tracks, but in English as random retains the memory of the irregular, unforeseen escape route of the game, and thus refers to the randomness of the route covered, expresses precisely the feeling of ambivalence that creeps over me when trying to grasp the multiple interferences of the digital in the practice of historical work. So grasping is meant here in the sense of Cassirer, of Ernst Cassirer, as a double act of grasping. Grasping or comprehending reality becomes a double act that involves gripping on it, he wrote in 1930 in his famous essay Form und Technik. So comprehending reality in linguistic and theoretical terms and grasping it through efficiency, the intellectual and the technical form. Yeah, in German, the term really of erfassen describes this double act in a very literal sense. So it's precisely at this interface between theory and practice, conceptual penetration and methodological reflection of historical scholarship in the digital age that my reflections on digital hermeneutics of historical scholarship begin. It is this tension between a discipline based on 19th century methodological foundations and the radically changing knowledge economy of the 21st century that forces us to rethink and to adapt central concepts, practices, and infrastructures, and thus the subject's claim to relevance and scholarship. So digital research infrastructures, data sets, and tools now influence, I'm convinced, the way we think, the way we do, and the way we narrate history. So in short, how we produce historical meaning and try to interpret the past. As a practical epistemology of historiography, digital hermeneutics is thus interested in the tension between the strangeness and the familiarity of historical tradition. So this in-between, which according to the philosopher Hans-Georg Gadamer, is the true place of hermeneutics. So if we accept that hybridity is the new normal, we need, I think, an update of historical hermeneutics to make explicit the many methodological and epistemological tensions in current historiographical practices. Applied digital hermeneutics is as much theory of practice as practice of theory. So as a conceptual framework, it invites us to think more systematically about what I call digital interferences in the iterative process of historical sense-making. This means concretely that we have to acquire new skills and competences in form of a critical digital literacy, which will enable us to first open up the black boxes of algorithm-driven search engines and thinking about new heuristics of search using online catalogs and repositories. It invites us to think about the so-called 6 V's of data integrity, so volume, velocity, variety, validity, veracity, and value. And so training us historians in what could describe as historical data criticism. It forces us to understand how digital tools co-construct our epistemic objects of study and turn us, the user of these new tools, into really manipulators of highly specific tools. It forces us to deconstruct what Joanna Drucker has described as the look of certainty of data visualizations by exploring the indexical but dynamic and relational relationship of back-end and front-end of dynamic interfaces. And finally, we need to develop a multimodal competence to decode the narrative conventions of transmedia storytelling and the relational logics of web applications and archives that enable new forms and formats of historical storytelling. I've been reflecting on these methodological challenges of such an update of classical hermeneutics to the digital at several occasions already. That's why I would like to concentrate today on two other dimensions of the digital, which perhaps have a more subtle influence on historical thinking, as they are more philosophical or epistemological in nature. The first dimension I would like to talk about today is the symbolic dimension of digital tools and infrastructures, or what Sheila Jasanoff and Sang-Yeon Kim call the socio-technical imaginaries of the dreamscapes of modernity. Second, I would like to focus on the dimension of the imaginary, that is, the influence of digital representations of the past on our historical imagination, or what Frank Ankersmit has described as sublime historical experience. It is not only in popular science and literature that the era of digitality or the digital age is closely interwoven with the nimbus of the revolutionary and the disruptive power of radical innovations. As has happened before with all new mass media, the horizon of expectation of the digital was shaped and is shaped by socio-technical imaginaries, but based on a relatively stable trope of modernist and futurist figures of speech and images. In his 2005 book, The Digital Sublime, the communication scholar Vincent Moscow deconstructed the methodological dimension of the cyberspace and the internet narratives, pointing to the subtle appeal of that discourse that constructs the digital age as a radically, society transforming watershed in human history. Already in 2003, Roy Rosenzweig, one of the pioneers really of digital historiography and who gave his name to the Roy Rosenzweig Center for New Media and History in Fairfax, Mason University, postulated the transition from an age of scarcity to an age of abundance, which is characterized by an unprecedented supply of evidence from the near and the distant past in this kind of accessibility online. While the topos of information overload runs like a red thread through the history of knowledge, the internet and the World Wide Web have, in the words of another pioneer of digital history in the German-speaking world, Peter Haber, revived another phantasm, the phantasm of the universally available knowledge, which he described as Google syndrome in his book, Digital Past. 10 years after Haber's and Rosenzweig's publications in the early 2000s, the analogies of Wikipedia as the new Library of Alexandria of our time, and the Wikipedians as Diderot's legitimate heirs were overrun by the big data metaphor, which quickly became the new mantra of these socio-political fantasies, only to be overlaid in recent years by the umpteenth renaissance of artificial intelligence as the central socio-technical imagination of the future. So the horizons of expectation expressed in these discourses could easily be embedded into the longue durée of stable tropes that characterize the narratives of technical progress and modernity. But this is not my concern. Rather, I am asking myself what notions of time and historical imagination and experience are expressed in these phantasms, metaphors, and myth, and what significance these notions or expectations might have for historical research. Since the social constructivist turn in the humanities and social sciences, we know that discourses are not passive linguistic representations of reality, but play an active part in co-shaping society and politics as much as they co-construct science and technology. Quite naturally, then, they influence the way we think about history too. So my initial question could therefore be reformulated as follows. Is the digital age a new temporal regime that structures our relationship to the past, the present, and the future in a different and new way? We have become victims of our ever-increasing capacity to store, organize, instantly access, and share vast amounts of cultural data, says Simon Reynolds in his book Retromania. Not only has there never before been a society so obsessed with the cultural artifacts of its immediate past, but there has never before been a society that is able to access the immediate past so easily and so copiously. According to Reynolds, rapid technological change generates feelings of nostalgia and has made the present as well as the past a foreign country. This observation is in line with the findings of historians and cultural anthropologists such as François Hartog in France, Andreas Heusen, or Aleida Assmann, who attest that to a cultural time regime in our present, who attest that the cultural time regime of our present is characterized by an extended or even voracious simultaneity that pulls everything into more and destroys not only the difference of times, but also historical consciousness. Un présent monstre, says Hartog. At the same time, according to Aleida Assmann, this presentism is characterized by an unprecedented reactualization of the past, a new chronotopos in which the approaches to the past have multiplied. To me, it is surprising that none of these authors, at least not in a systematic way, cite the digital turn as one of the possible causes of this new temporal regime of presentism. Assmann and Heusen identify the memory boom since the 1980s as the main cause of this new regime, while Hartog points to the crisis of the modern time regime, which had been characterized by its systematic orientation towards the future since the so-called Sattelzeit. In contrast to these, here I forgot to show some of the book titles. In contrast to those cultural historians and anthropologists, media studies, as well as numerous authors from the field of digital humanities, hold the digital revolution and the big data turn responsible for that broad present, as Gumbrecht has called it. From this perspective, the culture of digitality is characterized by a socio-technical imagination that is determined by the idea of connectivity. According to Andrew Hoskins, one of the leading authors in the field of digital memory studies, the connective turn enables a previously unknown and privileged access to the past. I quote, "The network's self and society foster a view that collapses past and present into an orgy of hyperconnectivity, an impossible fantasy of prior generations, which their now forgotten, closed and contained media imaginaries." So while Hoskins recognizes in hyperconnectivity a new culture of memory in real time, others interpret the digital age as a temporal regime characterized by mass forgetting. I quote, "In the digital age, in what is perhaps the most fundamental change for humans since our humble beginnings, that balance of remembering and forgetting has become converted or inverted. Sorry. Committing information to digital memory has become the default and forgetting the exception," says Victor Meyer-Schönberger in his inspiring essay, "Delete, the Virtue of Forgetting in the Digital Age." Meyer-Schönberger makes a simple calculation for this. While the cost of storing and staging analog testimonies was immensely high, think about huge national archives, not only for written records, but also for audiovisual ones. The cost of digital storage has fallen so dramatically, I quote, "that it is simply no longer economical to even decide whether to remember or forget. Forgetting the 3 seconds it takes to choose has become too expensive for people to use." So this new form of digital forgetting is what Aleida Assmann calls custodial forgetting. We store thousands of digital photos, videos, emails on our smartphones or laptops in the naive hope of retrieving them again someday. This question of digital forgetting is even more relevant for the leading medium of the digital age, the internet. Contrary to the widespread view that the internet forgets nothing, UNESCO warned of a future digital dark age in its Charter on the Preservation of Digital Heritage, published already in 2003. Studies on the half-life of hyperlinks on the internet show that only 50% of 100 links function after 2 years. This phenomenon, known as link rot, is compounded by the fact that the average lifespan of a website is 8 months. So the exceptional increase in new data volumes conceals the tendency towards self-dissolution inherent in the dynamic character of the web. This ephemeral character of the World Wide Web poses enormous methodological challenges for future generations of historians. So far, the archiving of the internet has been extremely patchy, and even where national or private initiatives exist, we are dealing with special digital conglomerates, which Niels Brügger describes as reborn digital medium. The World Wide Web is a medium that connects visible and invisible text layers, hyperlinks, and fragmented information units in a complex network structure. This dynamic and relational architecture of the web is responsible for the fact that when we retrieve an archived web page, we are dealing with what he calls digital reincarnations, whose informational, content-related, and representational integrity are corrupted or manipulated in multiple ways. So an archived and reborn website is always the result of a double transformation. Both the archiving process, for example, through the use of web crawling software, and its reactivation, for example, through the Wayback Machine, actively intervene in the systematic order and visual representation of the relational data stocks, and thus make classical principles of archival science, such as respect des fonds and respect de l'ordre, obsolete. At this point, I'm not concerned with the problem of historical data integrity of websites, but with the double temporality inscribed in the web as being at the same time a passive storage and an active memory medium. So while historians visiting classical archives do not intervene in the organization and logic of the system, the archive, or the library, users of the Wayback Machine become co-constructors of a new epistemic object, which looks different on every single computer people use, since the revived website never existed in that form in the past. Wendy Chun, professor of new media at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, therefore speaks of the World Wide Web as enduring ephemeral, creating unforeseen degenerative links between humans and machines. In contrast to the tension between evidence and erasure inherent in other types of analog sources, in the case of digital data, and especially in the case of the web, we are dealing with the simultaneity of the non-simultaneous, whose temporality could be described as updatism, in the words of the Brazilian historians Mateus Pereira and Valdeo Arajo. I quote, "A specific temporalization of time that connects the past with the present and the future." So contrary to the rather pessimistic note that resonates in Hartog's concept of presentism, in which the victory of memory politics over history is deplored, or even Gumbrecht's idea of the broad present, in which the definitive end of modernity is lamented, updatism means the continuous act of reactualizing the past, present, and future time references in real time. But does this digital availability of historical data in real time mean that the mobile accessibility of the past, for example, on our mobile phones or tablets, also changes our historical experience or imagination? Absolutely. I have two examples. As Claudio Fugo, Wolf Kampsteiner, and Top Pressner have shown using the example of Holocaust remembrance, digital media such as Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, or the virtual staging of eyewitnesses in the Visual History Archive of the Shoah Foundation, pose an aesthetic and moral challenge for history's education and memory policy, as they can directly influence the perception and experience of authentic testimonies or places, for example, during a visit to the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp. The so-called selfie debate of 2014 exemplifies the complex overlapping of an institutionalized commemorative culture and the contemporary digital media practices. Authentic on-site experience and the synchronous sharing of one's own dark tourism experiences in social media merge into a single historical experience, a kind of digital commemorative culture. Using the example of the commemoration of the Great War on Twitter on the occasion of its 100th anniversary, Frédéric Claver has shown that the circulation of commemorative speech acts on social media platforms can really be interpreted as a new temporal regime, differing radically from the longue durée of cultural memory that shaped the commemorations of the First War at earlier anniversaries. Based on an analysis of over, I think it's now 5 million tweets archived in a database between the 1st of April 2014 and the 22nd of November 2016, based on German, French, and English hashtags, Claver hypothesizes that remembering at what he describes as high frequency rate of social media signifies a new quality of commemorative memory formation characterized by both distributed authority and a collective reference to traces of the past. So if one accepts that the finding of deep mediatization postulated by Andreas Hepp, stating that the co-construction of our mediated reality is characterized by an ever increased rhythm and speed, then it seems but logical that our experience and imagination of the past, which are essentially mediated by media in our time, are deeply affected by this development. While the historical culture of the 19th century was characterized by the sensual grace of historical novels or national museums, it is network visualizations, deep mapping technologies, and multilinear timelines in virtual exhibitions that stimulate the historical imagination in the digital age. Interactive interfaces and relational databases filled with thousands or millions of sources of different genres create a new historical sense that, according to Alan Leo, refuses the ideology of linearity of historical thinking. I quote, "We might say that the essential hermeneutic, or what we might today call algorithm, of historicism was to interpret all the spatial and political barriers that impeded full-on human sociality as temporal delay. Civilization was the delayed action of sociality unfolding in historical time. The temporality of shared culture is no longer experienced as unfolding narration, but instead as real-time media. Dynamic visualizations of the complex relationships of historical processes and events generate a new historical knowledge, which Leo calls hypergraphical knowledge. I quote again, "The digital age promotes hypergraphical models of knowledge that conform to a worldview in which knowledge is conceived by default to be multi-perspectival and multi-scalar, distributed in its foci and relations, and connecting all the disparate nodes and levels, meaning ultimately networked." Like Alan Leo, the American media theorist Lev Manovich describes the digital data visualizations of cultural artifacts and collections as a new language that we must learn if we want to generate meaning from the big data of the past in the future. Until now, we have left this meaning making which is usually reduced to the visualization of patterns generated on the basis of statistical modeling, to the computer and data scientists. But their epistemic culture is clearly different from the hermeneutic tradition of the humanities. Although both scientific cultures now often share the same digital tools and computer or software-based methods, the problems and objects of investigation between, on the one side, computer and data scientists, and on the other side, humanities, diverge considerably. I quote Levmanovich, "Thus we have two research universes that often use the same computational methods, but apply them to different cultures. On the humanities side, we have the past that stretches into the hundreds or even thousands of years. On the computer science side, we have the present that starts in the beginning of the 21st century. On the humanities side, we have artifacts created by professional elites. On the computer science side, we have artifacts and online behavior by everybody else." So while most sociocultural data analyzed by means of algorithm-based machine learning methods in the computer sciences are so-called digital born sources, we are usually, as historians, dealing with much smaller data sets of historical sources, which are characterized by a great complexity and diversity. Most of the tools in text mining, for example, in digital history, for the recognition of proper names of even in topic analysis, are programmed to recognize patterns or calculating frequency distributions, but not to identify deviations, particularities, or singularities, which usually interest us historians more than statistical averages. So this tension between, on the one side, the machine-driven search for patterns and trends, and the problem and question-driven search for the historically specific and particular, requires, I think, a hermeneutics of in-betweenness, which Stephen Ramsey has so nicely described in his book, Reading Machines Towards an Algorithmic Criticism. I quote again, "Trying to locate a hermeneutics at the boundary between mechanism and theory. Algorithmic criticism proposes a hermeneutics of screwing around, that we channel the heightened objectivity made possible by a machine into the cultivation of a heightened, or those heightened subjectivities necessary for critical work." The fact that data in the humanities is complex, fuzzy, and very often incomplete is common knowledge. It is therefore surprising that many research projects in digital historiography are reduced to relatively simple questions, such as the search for or identification of so-called named entities, such as person names, place names, and time references. Questions about the where, who, and when could be described as the little basics of historical work, das kleine Einmaleins. But questions about the how, the why, or the what can hardly be answered with most of the digital tools to date. So many text-based projects of the first and second wave of digital humanities are characterized or were characterized by a rather positivistic approach, which was due to the logic of the instruments and tools with which the digital corpora were interrogated. In my opinion, the epistemological potential of such work increases considerably with the overcoming of statistical modeling in the direction of question and problem-driven simulations. Only when algorithms specializing in pattern recognition or frequency distributions can be combined with complex modeling of historical change and structural past dependencies to form time and space simulations, will digital history contribute new impulses to the theorizing of complex historical processes. It was, I'm coming slowly to the end now, it was the predominantly ahistorical approach of positivist and empiricist research in the 19th century that spurred Wilhelm Dilthey to formulate his hermeneutic theory of the humanities. According to Dilthey, a historical understanding of the past is necessarily based on the recognition of the fundamental layeredness of both past and present facts and effects. Without denying the possibility of structural causalities, Dilthey emphasized the individuality of perception, imagination, and thought that is necessary to develop a critical approach to history and to understand both structural forces and individual action in an interpretative way. Transferred to the digital historical sciences, this means, in my view, that only the combination of machine-based methods of distant reading with the hermeneutic tradition of close reading will lead to the connection of generic phenomena will lead to a new understanding of the historical realities. This ability of what we describe as scalable reading, of zooming in and out from the general to the specific, so the combination of explorative and interpretative analysis of data is a new episode in the cultural technique of reading that is still foreign to most of us at the moment. It will probably take another generation before this new form of scale-based reading is as familiar to us as reading on a screen or virtual scrolling on a smartphone is the new normal for us today. As with Dilthey, we need to approach the foreign in the hermeneutic process of being in between. I quote, "Interpretation would be impossible if the expressions of life were completely foreign. It would be unnecessary if nothing required elsewhere where something is alien that the art of understanding is supposed to make its own." Sorry, I was skipping one line. I start again. "Interpretation would be impossible if the expressions of life were completely foreign. It would be unnecessary if nothing in them were foreign." So it lies between these two extreme opposites. It's required everywhere where something is alien that the art of understanding is supposed to make its own. This was one of the conclusions in Dilthey's Aufbau der geschichtlichen Welt in den Geisteswissenschaften around 1910. So again, it's this in-betweenness between the Vertrautheit and the Fremdheit that also Gadamer identified as really the place of hermeneutics. So when we as historians approach computer-based analysis and interpretations of the past today, we are, I think, performing precisely this kind of hermeneutic movement that has always been the work of the inquiring historian. We are applying the diagnostic procedure of searching for traces described so beautifully by Carlo Ginzburg, and at the same time creating historical meaning by producing a graphic narrative. Now in the digital space of retrospective divination, as he was calling it, retrospektive Wahrsagen. The fact that the information technology and database structure behind such digital productions, so the backend, is often remains hidden, is perhaps exactly what makes up their aura in the Benjamin sense. Trace is the appearance of a proximity, however distant what it was left behind. The aura is the appearance of a distance, however close that may be, which it evokes. In the trace, we get hold of thing. In the aura, it takes hold of us. Even if not all historians are equally affected by the aura of digital representations and visualizations, I'm convinced that it will be crucial for future generations of historians to critically engage with these tools and methods of big data analysis and the possibilities of data-driven visualizations of time and space. As historians, engaging in interdisciplinary and collaborative projects with the methods and concepts of data science means not only transferring classical skills such as source criticism or discourse analysis to digital data and corpora and adapting them to the specifics of digital media, but also a transfer of knowledge and skills in the direction of the technical disciplines. If data is king, context is its crown, said my Swedish colleague Pelle Snickers once, and really summed up very nicely the importance of the hermeneutic methods for the digital humanities. It's precisely this contextualization of large amounts of data that is seen as the central challenge for the future in interdisciplinary research fields such as climate or environmental research, and also occupies historians, archaeologists, and anthropologists who approach the past with the concept of deep history. How meaningful complex models and simulations of past realities and future scenarios will be depends not only on the amount of available data, but primarily on their contextualization and critical evaluation. Big data is the answer, but what is the question, asked the two historians of science and technology, Bruno Strasser and Paul Edwards, in a 2017 article in the journal Osiris. As a critical science that is question and problem driven, history can make an important contribution to a knowledge economy of the 21st century, which in a decisively provocative way was called for by Joe Goldie and Dave Armitage in 2014 in their polemic History Manifesto. It is therefore not only a matter of grasping what the D does to history, but also of asking what history does to D. So in updating the critical tradition of hermeneutics to the digital age, historians can and should engage actively in the shaping of a critical digital literacy that aims at understanding the complexities of both past and present societies. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. FICKERS. We are very inspiring talk. I think it pinpoints phenomena that many of us have stumbled upon without finding the right words for them, something that you did very well. Before we address the questions from the audience, let me pose two questions myself. My first question directly concerns your talk. You spoke about tensions in the hermeneutical process when using digital methods and with difficulties to come to terms with them. Could it be that there is now the expectation to give account of serendipity in the research process to a much higher degree than before? What about the aura, or perhaps the illusion, of reproducibility that comes with formalized algorithms? Perhaps you could tell us whether and how serendipity and reproducibility connect to what you just talked about. And my second question is more general and has to do with how digital infrastructure will influence language diversity in publications. I think that exploring citation networks through digital interfaces makes it easier to notice research in languages besides those that we understand. Perhaps we can read the abstract and we can then get into contact with the author in a language both understand. However, this potential could be lost through the vulgar but very real imperative of publish and perish. In your opinion, how will language diversity in research develop, and what could be the most important factors in this? Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much for two very, very good and very big questions. First, I will try to talk about the question of serendipity and traceability. This is really going to the very heart of my concern when it comes to the skills and competence I was describing in this framework of digital hermeneutics. What we have seen in the past 20 years, I think, of digital humanities scholarship is that very often we are faced with sometimes very fashionable products of such research in terms of visualizations, network visualizations, or other forms, but we are not able to look at the back end, at the data structures, at the tools which have been used, or the algorithms for producing that kind of narrative. So what we really need is traceability in terms of also transparency of how this iterative process, characterized by many feedback mechanisms, that was what we tried to visualize in this last slide, how to make this implicit interferences of the digital in the whole process of research explicit. We know that in classical journals so far, you will never be able to publish a lengthy description of these methodological implications or tool criticism and so on. They will simply say, no, that's maybe a small footnote, but no. And that's what we really need to change. And the journal that we just launched, the Journal of Digital History, tries to do exactly this, to have the possibility, first of all, to present new forms of digital scholarship in a format that really allows to show what you have been doing in a dynamic and multimedia way. But second, it asks every author to very explicitly describe on this hermeneutic level what you have been doing during that process, how you have collected your data, curated your data, cleaned your data, analyzed your data, and so on. This has to be made explicit in this hermeneutic layer. And finally, if possible, you have to publish the data so that people can redo what you have been doing or testing your hypothesis, because we also publish the code. So this is for me really a way to produce that kind of traceability that you were asking for, which remains for most of the publications so far, which remains totally black boxed. So we need to open up those black boxes. But yeah, it requires really new ways of publication of our scholarship. and is also a challenge for the community in terms of peer reviewing, because you will need people that are able to not only look at the stories, but the story level, but also at the data level and the software level. Does this answer your question?
Yes, the second question regarding the language usage also has probably to do with the referees, etc.
Yes, no, multilinguality is a big issue. I think in the field of digital humanities and digital history, I agree that I'm speaking from a country which is multilingual. We really see that as a huge challenge. When we organized the DH Benelux conference some years ago, we focused on exactly this question of multilinguality, and we see a clear, of course, dominance of English-speaking tools and also data sets in the field. But I'm more optimistic than I really was a few years ago, because I see that big DH communities in Germany, in France, in Italy. I'm speaking just about the European frame that I know better, are really emerging, and through a European infrastructure like DARIA, we really see that the multilingual elements become a key concern, and that we are making progress here. And so I'm more optimistic than I was a few years ago, I must say.
Yeah, I think the international infrastructure will also be also develop. Japanese language publications have had problems, or rather have not been given very much attention in Google Scholar, for example, but the national infrastructure that is built will probably integrate well with the European infrastructure, and these issues that are existing will be solved not only on the European level, but on the bigger level, I think. Yes.
We just did a project with Switzerland, with Swiss colleagues from EPFL in Lausanne and Zurich, where we worked on a corpus of 200 fully digitized newspapers of Luxembourg and Switzerland that were in French and in German. So here we really also experimented quite successfully with also automatic translation. So we have seen an enormous progress in these tools over the past years, which really make historical research or linguistic research in a multilingual fashion much more promising in, I think, the coming years.
Okay, so let us open up the round for public discussion. I'd ask the audience to raise their hands with the Zoom function, and then I will call on them. And we already have a contribution by Jana Kek. I will make a post now. Okay, Jana, please.
Hi Harald and Andreas. Andreas, thank you so much for your presentation. To be honest, your concept of temporality in time really struck with me, you know, as my role as doing historical research. On the one hand, that so much data is available, you know, not only in terms of born digital material as primary sources, but also secondary sources. And this really kind of can be, like, in terms of the sublime, right, very overwhelming because there's so much available. But at the same time, I'm asking myself, could that time or that temporality that you have so much access and quickly access also change the role of the historian or the humanities scholar in general as a more and playing an active part in history, in the sense that by immediately analyzing the data set, so to speak, right, or identifying racist models, sexist models, and so ever, that we could also have a much faster impact, you know, on how history will proceed. So my question really is, do you see that the role of the historian in the digital age becomes a much more active role, as opposed to rather, let's say, the passive storyteller?
Yeah, thanks, Jana, for your question. I mean, that is exactly what was at the heart of the provocative history manifesto that I mentioned by Joe Goldie and Dave Armitage. So they argue that, yeah, the big data of the past that is not only of interest to historians, but for many other disciplines like climate science, environmental sciences, and so on. They all look at big data of the past, not the way we look at it in order to study the past, but they look at it in order to make possible predictions for the future. And here lies one of the tensions I was trying to describe, because they miss sometimes the kind of hermeneutic tradition of contextualizing those data sets of the past. And my argument is to say, my point of view is to say, this is exactly why we historians have to intervene. We shouldn't leave that up to the climate scientists and or to the economics scholars, or to make use of that data in order to develop models and simulations that have an impact on policy making today. No, we should raise our voices as historians and say, yeah, let's do it together, but let's also include that critical tradition of source criticism that we have developed over 200 years as historians, which make us much more sensitive to the biases and uncertainties that are in data sets or in the sources. So, but I really want historians, or would wish historians to be more proactive in those debates and discussions, and to say we have a say in it, and we should do this together rather than leaving it for the others. And that would give historians a different voice also in contemporary debates. And I think it would be a very welcomed voice.
Okay, so there was another hand, Benjamin Boyer, there was second, I think. So I will make him co-host, please.
Okay, should be okay. Thanks a lot for this really fascinating presentation, and these are topics, of course, that concern us all, sort of. So I think what Jana mentioned and what you made very clear, the point how to deal with this enormous mass of data, and that it's important to have the hermeneutics in it when dealing with it and the role of historians. I think this is totally understand very, very a point I'm taking at once. The other question is, of course, how to access the data. And I was wondering if we are entering a period, a new phase also, where big private enterprises like Facebook not only have an enormous influence on what is going on in the present, on moods, on political developments, etc., but also have a key to the past. With all the mass of data they sort of guard. And I don't know if there's any discussion you're aware of how to deal with this problem, that there's a privatization sort of this part of the past, which is concerning billions of people.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, you're touching on a very sensitive issue, of course, of who owns the past in terms of digital archives, and one has to be very clear about, of course, the power structures inscribed into such new digital archives. But in a way, it's also nothing new for us historians. When we think about the emergence of archives as we know them today, the national archives, they were also the result of a power play in the 19th century when the nation state wanted to be in control of what future historians might be writing about the history. So I think this is a kind of red thread that runs through the question of archiving, of preservation, and of access. So it's clearly a power issue, and it would be, I think, too simplistic to see the age of abundance that Roy Rosenzweig was describing, and also a new age of democratization. I think that's not necessarily the case. When you study, for example, as I was referring to the work of Frédéric Claver, tweets about the commemoration of the First World War, you know that you have very limited possibilities of getting access to those sources, digital-born sources. Twitter will only allow you to use a minor part of tweets and so on. For Facebook and others, it's even more complicated. So this is a huge problem and challenge. On the other side, we have seen, like with the pandemic now, we see historians all over the world starting to build digital archives for the future in real time themselves, making crowdsourcing activities and trying to collect data on events. And this, I think, will also have possibly a positive effect on the work of the historian in the future. The big challenge being, of course, that of long-term preservation and of storage, because it's easy to crawl the web with some software, but then to make those data sets available and keep them in a sustainable and long-term storage on your own computer. No, this is what I was describing, referring to Aleida Assmann, this kind of custodian fantasy that we have, that all of us build their own small digital archives on their computers, but we are not trained as archivists and digital preservation specialists at all. So I think this should also be part of the training of the next generation of historians, not only digital literacy, but also how to deal with data management in a sustainable and long-term perspective.
Regarding COVID, we at the German Institute of Japanese Studies, I employ topic modeling for analytic research, but we also provide it to other members at the Institute for explorative purposes on the Japanese parliamentary minutes. We have a data set gathered on COVID for the usual terms a bit. Well, this is a data set that will be preserved, and it is a bit shallow, but nevertheless, probably people will see different things in the data set, and then we would have to merge it with wider data sets. Yes. Okay, so this much that. Next one, Florian Windhager. Please.
Okay, I also wanted to say thanks for these reflections, and I wanted to follow up with a rather simple question. If you can possibly point to exemplary work that would be located at this intersection maybe two intersections actually you mentioned as relevant. And one would be work that actually tries to bridge this work of entity extraction, structural analysis, network analysis, including possibly visualization. And I think you mentioned simulation. You mentioned that this would help to overcome the rather basic Einmal-Eins operations on the one side. And I'm just wondering if you could point to exemplary work, because I think the pacemakers of both technologies are to be found usually in different communities. And maybe a similar question would be, even on a higher level, if you could point to work that or actors that are actively trying to bridge the gap between hermeneutic history and digital history. If there are specific venues you would mention in this case, or if there might be maybe a reenactment of this 2019 conference you mentioned before.
What do you mean by a reenactment of the 2019 conference?
I think that was your initial link to a conference on digital hermeneutics. And yeah. I think, I'm not sure if this is a recurring event or if it was.
Okay. Yeah, there will. We were planning to have the next conference in Washington this year in December, but it unfortunately will have to be postponed to 2nd to 4th of June next year. So it's a serial event. Every 2 years we are organizing this cycle of conferences. The next one, as I said, will again be in Washington, but then in 2 years it will be Luxembourg. So we'll be alternating between the US and Europe. So this is a kind of forum that we want to establish for discussing exactly these kind of issues. Sorry, remind me of your first question.
That was about work that would try to bridge the gap between, well, structural analysis and simulation in the digital history context.
Yeah. This is, I think, the next step that we will see in the near future. So what, for example, Lev Manovich is doing in New York, and he's just published the book Cultural Analytics, where he's trying to do exactly this, to move from a more statistically driven modeling of historical data or cultural data to a more dynamic simulation of historical change. And this is, I think, the big challenge of the future, how we can turn those more static models into more dynamic ones. It's a question not only of data, but more of the software, which will be developed in order to deal with different kind of parameters, where we can combine the knowledge we have already from historical studies that have focused on longue durée developments, on structural developments, how we can combine those findings with a more explorative reading of big data, which is based then on machine learning. So I think this is what also is driving the, I don't know if you have heard about the European Time Machine initiative, where HPC, high performance computing, software development, and the big data of the past in terms of collections and data are trying to come together to work towards this more dynamic visualization of history. This is, I think, a huge challenge, and we are at the very beginning of this, despite some traditions in the field of economy, for example, or even now in climate sciences. But from the center where I'm working, we are trying to do this on a small scale Luxembourg time machine, bringing together data from, for example, chemical data, looking at water pollution and air pollution, together with more contextualizing sources from industry and enterprise archives. We are just about to learn to speak each other's languages, and we have to build an infrastructure that allows us to make sense of those different data sets and make them speak to each other, which is not only a technical issue, but it's, for me, mainly an issue also of visualization. So how to make sense of these data sets, and again to inscribe in those interfaces the idea of hermeneutics, that is to visualize lacunas, visualize uncertainties, missing information, gaps, which are generally not shown in these network visualizations or other forms of visualizing. So I think our role as historians is really to bring in that kind of critical perspective of source criticism or data criticism, and to make this somehow visible in the interfaces we develop. One example would be the project I mentioned, Impresso, that we did with the Swiss partners, where we really developed an interface which constantly reminds the user that he is manipulating the data set when doing specific search queries, where we, for example, always show the machine-readable version of a newspaper text next to the facsimile of the original one, so that we are constantly reminded, okay, what the machine found, what the algorithm found in the database, you have to confront it with the historical facsimile, which immediately gives you a different understanding when you see where this article was published in the newspaper. Was it the front page? What was next to it? So all that kind of paratextual information that is key for historical analysis is left out of the machine reading part. And in confronting those on a systematic way in the interface, this is, I think, the new kind of scalable reading that we will need to develop as a critical method.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, we had a question by Achim Alan de Merlot. Before, I would suggest that he poses the question himself if he wants. Achim?
Yes, sorry if I don't turn the camera on because my connection is not the best. My question is concerning, sorry for the misspell, by the way, because Brodel is just made the way in which it's pronounced. If I understood well, you have a kind of approach as digital age is a sort of break in a linearity approach to history. And you just a few minutes ago mentioned the fact of the longue durée. And in fact, this is the point which I would like to ask you. If we take your presentation and we, let's say, put it in a case of a Brodelian approach to history, how will you see this digital age in a way in which is just part of a wave, which one day or another will decline and another wave will come? Maybe we are just living in this period and we see things from inside, but in history, in the future, as we have seen in the past, it might be just a period of time in which there will be a decline and another wave will come. So if you interpret this period, let's say from the cybernetic revolution of the 60s and till now, where we are living in this new framework of interpretation, like a paradigm itself, how will you interpret that in this approach? I would say in a Brodelian way. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for your question. So the purpose of my my talk of today was really to think about time more in the concept of temporal regimes. So it's very much about how we as historians think about time and how we construct images of the past and the present. So it's not the historical time in the sense of Brodel. So when I look at it from a longue durée perspective, I would be fully with you saying, okay, the digital will be in a few hundred years seen as maybe the start of something different, but which clearly resonates with the long cycles of developments in history. So maybe nothing radically new in that sense. But nevertheless, what I like very much about Brodel's concept of time is that he already thought of time as being multi-layered. So you always have different temporalities that play at the very same time. So you have these long cycles, but you have also he recognizes the importance of specific events in history which can have an impact on changing structures, for example. So you have revolutionary moments maybe in history which are clearly linked to specific events. So he thinks of time as being multi-layered. And this, I think, is coming closer to also concepts I've been discussing in terms of temporal regime, or Reinhard Koselleck's idea of Zeitschichten. And my interest is really more on how the digital changes our imagination, our experience of the past, rather than developing maybe a new historical temporality in which we place the digital as one phase. I think this is up to the future generations to do that kind of periodization.
Okay, thank you very much, and very much congratulations for your presentation. It was really terrific. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, any other questions right now? If not, I have something to add. Right now, I'm researching discourses on data in Japan, and from a conceptual viewpoint, but focusing on data practices. So if I read your research, raw data is an oxymoron, etc. These works are cited. I encounter them while researching the present, and but then the trading zone where digital historians encounter programmers and so on. I thought whether for trading zones, there have to be two distinct cultures already established, or multiple ones. I wonder whether that could not be, whether this, if these are lacking, whether something like a contact zone would emerge where they play by different rules, and then could, coherent with the metaphor of the frontier, one could lose out from the viewpoint of the historian, that it seems that you, and probably many historians, consider themselves as sovereign, not that much in the danger of being usurped by purely quantified methods. That is actually, which is the case in the social science that I experience very much at the Institute. So I would be interested whether what you would say about in the trading zone existing cultures in these different groups, and if they are lacking, what would that mean for the cooperation?
Yeah, thank you very much, Harald. I'm taking the opportunity of showing you a book that has just been published by one of my PhD students, Max Kemmern, who has a training as computer scientist and had done this PhD now in history, focusing really on this concept of trading zones in digital history. And he has analyzed those encounters between epistemic communities, historians and computer scientists at different levels, at the level of projects, at the level of centers, and on a international level in terms of communities, associations, and so on. And here clearly he was able to show that this trading zone sometimes produces positive effects and in really helping to establish something like a common language or interactional expertise, but sometimes also and very often fails. And one really has to contextualize this interaction very carefully on a local level, on a project level, on an international level, to understand why sometimes this is a fruitful encounter and why sometimes this is an encounter with a lot of frustrations and also failures. So I would fully agree that these contact zones, as you call them, exist at various levels, and that it's really the kind of contextual environment that is very important in understanding why it can work out or not. And so he has really been trying to analyzing this, and at the end promotes the idea of digital historians as a kind of knowledge broker that can, after a successful incubation phase, so to speak, into such a trading zone, is then able to act as a mediator.
Okay. Good. Franz, Altenberger, our Institute.
Yeah, well, thanks a lot. Actually, I was both misunderstanding, I think, the term history you used in your title and the term time regime. But I think I got your message, and I would say you could exchange the term history. I mean, you could also say for the social sciences. What does D mean for the social sciences? Because we confront, I mean, I'm an economist, we confront the same phenomenon. We are driven by developments, and we are trying to catch up and adjust and so on. And and you wonder how you can keep your sort of your disciplinary your discipline sort of not being taken over by data scientists. The other point, of course, if maybe you could elaborate a little bit more what you mentioned as the new scholarship, which is required, I mean, to really make, to really benefit from the digital age, from the availability of data and the computing power and so on. This kind of new scholarship, I get it, of course, it means a new data literacy, it means critical analysis and so on, it means interdisciplinarity. I mean, how can a young scholar cope with all these challenges, and how would maybe in the future would maybe scholarship also be I would visualize it as a new kind of also division of labor among scholars, that we will have maybe scholars who are more focusing on creating narratives. We have scholars who are more focusing on doing the critical analysis. And so it's not possible that everybody can master all the tasks required by this new scholarship, which I fully share your conclusion here. But in the way of how to implement that, I think there will be maybe some kind of division of labor, then a new kind of division of labor, maybe not across disciplinary boundaries, sort of but across, not within these disciplinary boundaries, but across disciplinary boundaries.
Oh, I fully agree. Of course, when I give talks about digital hermeneutics and all the skills and competences we need, I very often get this kind of reaction. But yeah, how the hell should we learn all of this and do all of this next to learning the kind of disciplinary traditions? And you're fully right. I think it requires changes on the very fundamental level of how we develop curricula. I think that digital literacy is something we need for all disciplines. So here we see at some universities really trends towards a more, Studium Generale again in terms of digital literacy. And on top of that, more specialized courses that reflect this on the level of the discipline. But the most important, and here I would fully agree with you, development I see is, at least in history, the end of the genius. History was very much a discipline characterized by the single author genius, who then presents a synthesis and an interpretation and becomes a kind of producer of a master narrative. Digital history definitely is teamwork. We try really also at the center in Luxembourg to establish a new culture of research that recognizes this necessity of collaboration, and and then translates that already at the level of how we write research proposals, how we define research questions. So we need that kind of co-design approach from the very start of a research project. So we have then developers, web designers, data managers around the table with historians when we think about a new project from the start, because otherwise you end up in this kind of fallacy that characterized lots of digital humanities projects in the first and second phase, that you see them as support, the technical support, develop me a tool and then I will change my research. No, it failed, it completely failed, because the tools have their own logic and very limited range in general of explanatory value. So you really need to develop tools in a co-construction, in a co-design process that fit the complex historical questions and inquiries. And so I see a clear trend towards a discipline which becomes not just a division of labor, but no, collaborative and teamworking. And this asks also for a change of recognition culture when we publish. So when we publish a paper, we should have, like in many other disciplines, not one author, but maybe 10 and 15 who participated in the production of that output.
Well, thank you very much.
Okay, regarding this, when I saw your new journal, didn't find the button to download the PDF yet. Perhaps it's not there in any way. It's not how it's supposed to work anymore. And it really has the feeling of a value-rich source edition together with the analysis. I wonder how the presentation integrates into the richer infrastructure that is built for other researchers to share their data and so on. So you're making the first step, but have you, in the design of the journal, taken into account how to network these things with broader infrastructural consensus that has emerged?
Yeah, we thought very carefully about this, and that's why we also teamed up with De Gruyter as a publisher, because we could have done the journal as it stands now on the website without a publisher. But we teamed up with De Gruyter for exactly those reasons. So there will be a PDF version of a kind of reduced article available on the De Gruyter repository and website, also with the DOI and so on for long-term preservation and everything. But first of all, we want, of course, to have people exploring the possibilities of that new kind of historical writing at our website of the journal. But clearly, we are not sure and certain that we will be able to conserve this functionality endlessly. This is, of course, one of the biggest challenges in our field, the sustainability of such digital products. But we are sure to have, let's say, the PDF version stored on the Gruyter's side, and to have the data layer stored on DataSurf, from Stanford. So.
Yeah, so I think, we still welcome, we would have time for a few more questions, but of course we, people at least in Europe are, okay, Jana, you go ahead.
Yeah, I have one more question, because I mean, this actually concerns me, right? Historical research and how it is going to be done in the next couple of years. Because I'm torn between, right, that with my work, I want to write articles, but at the same time, I want to publish the code, I want to publish the data set, I want to have a data sheet that explains the data set. But of course, this is time consuming. And then thinking about that my discipline, is not valuing it, not yet, probably in a couple of years, but not yet.
That's why we created the journal.
Yes, yeah, that's one thing. I think that's one step forwards, but still in terms of, what German academia values, when it comes for, tenureship or other promotion systems and so on, that you don't have the group, right, that evaluates you. It's not a group of just digital historians that say, whoa, yes, of course, data sets, great. So sometimes I feel torn between, voices that that gave me advice in the sense of no, focus on single author papers in very historical journals, whereas other people then tell me, no, you have to be brave, you have to be different, you have to, even though if it's uncertain, right? So what's your advice there?
As you can imagine, I have this discussion with all of my PhD students and postdocs all the time. And I really have a clear advice for adopting a hybrid strategy. Still, the field, is quite conservative, and you need to publish, of course, in peer-reviewed journals and have monographs written, okay, but that should be paralleled, I think, or combined with a few more experimental publications, which show that you really are trying to do new things. And I'm feeling a change in also recognition of that work. And that's why we got also very positive feedbacks already on the journal initiative, because many people were frustrated after 10 years of doing pioneering work in digital history, not being able to showcase that work in classical journals. And I think we are really now at a point where it's not so much a problem in the next years of recognition culture any longer. I think quite the opposite, but we need the authors, the community, to be willing to invest in that new kind of writing, because it's, as you said, much more work than just writing a text. No, you have to do 5 times, 6 times the work. And so we are more nervous about how willing the community is to invest in that, but not just to have the few pioneers publishing work, but really to engage a larger audience of historians in making this attractive. That's why we also will try to help people in producing that kind of scholarship. But yeah, if we were not convinced about its use, we wouldn't have invested in it.
Okay, Benjamin Beuerle.
If there's still time for a question, I was just wondering, as you said that in the near future, all historians will need digital literacy as a competence, right? And this really needs to enter the curricula, which makes sense. I was just wondering, do you see a generation of lost historians or a lost generation of historians coming who don't have this literacy? As so far this isn't in the curricula in most cases, or hasn't been. So what to do with this mass of historians, or do they just enter this in this share of labor you just described?
I wouldn't speak about the lost generation maybe, but I mean, I would argue that 90% of all historians having a faculty position at institutes of history miss that digital literacy right now, and so it's a generational gap that we will see over the next 20 years. I think therefore that it's not just about changing the curricula, but training the trainers. So we have a program here at the University of Luxembourg where we invest heavily in training the trainers. So it's us, this analog-born generation, that need to learn and to train ourselves. And this is, yeah, for some colleagues, clearly a no-go. Once you're a professor, yeah, you know everything, and it's yeah, very hard. But I see more and more really also at the Historiker Tag, for example, 2 weeks ago, there was hardly any panel where colleagues really didn't acknowledge the need for training and for learning new skills. So I see this also as a big opportunity. And of course, we know that universities are very conservative institutions and that it can take long. That's why I was speaking also the scalable reading about a generation. This will take 30 years easily before we really yeah, have appropriated this as a cultural technique of reading that is, yeah, normal to us. And the same goes for curricula. I think in the universities, it will take another 10, 15, 20 years before this has become standard.
Okay. Anything else? Franz, do you want to add something?
Well, that's, I mean, on your last note, at least today we were we were ahead of time, no? I mean, with your, so to speak, ahead of time, things that will get hopefully accepted in a few years. We learned today. And I think that was really eye-opening and thought-provoking, not only for people, I think, in your discipline, but also for social scientists in general, I think. So I'd like to thank you very much again for your lecture, for answering the various questions. Also thank the audience who held out. Well, you see that Japan is approaching 11 o'clock at night. They have been dropping out, but Europe is still there. And yeah, thanks a lot. And I hope at some time in the near future, we can have this discussion and presentation in Tokyo with you in person. I think that would be very delightful. Thank you very much. And a good day in Europe. Good night here from Japan.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.